In this video, we are going to see the backward and compatible changes and the new features that have been added from PHP 7.0 to PHP 7.1. I'm going to have two services. The first one will be running PHP 7.0 CLI and the second will be running PHP 7.1 CLI in order for me to be able to execute two scripts over here in two PHP versions. So if I execute PHP-v in my first container, which is running PHP 7.0, I'm going to have PHP 7.0. And if I run PHP-v in my second container, which is running PHP 7.1, I'm going to have PHP 7.1.33. So I will be using these two terminals to test my code against two versions of PHP. Now let's move on to the first backward and compatible change, which is exception for few arguments. Say that I have a function named hello that takes param as a parameter and echo it. If I call this function without parameter in PHP 7.0, I'm not going to have a problem. I'm going to have a small warning, but my script will execute without error. So if I execute PHP, one error exception for few arguments, I'm going to have warning missing argument for hello, but my code will execute. Now if I execute that in PHP 7.1, I'm going to have a problem. So let's try this out. And we have a fatal error, uncat argument count error, too few arguments for function hello. So if I define a required parameter, I should pass it in my function. That's the first change. Now the second change is forbid void and iterable keywords, meaning that I no longer have the right to use void or iterable in my code for classes, interfaces, or traits. This code over here will be executing fine in PHP 7.0. So if I execute PHP 2 forbid void iterable keywords, I'm not going to have an error. But in PHP 7.1, this code won't execute. So if I do PHP forbid void iterable keywords PHP, which is this code over here, I'm going to have fatal error cannot use void as class name. And if I comment this part over here, I'm going to have the same message for iterable. Fatal error cannot use iterable as a class name. So void and iterable are forbidden starting from PHP 7.1 as names for classes, interfaces, or traits. Now the third change is the empty index operator. The empty index operator, which is this symbol over here, is no longer supported for strings. So if I define an empty string and then use this expression over here, a and then an empty array operator equals hello world, this code will execute in PHP 7.0 and will give me an array with hello world as first item, as in index 0. But in PHP 7.1, this will give me an error. Let's try this out. If I execute PHP and then 3, I'm going to have an array with hello world as index 0. But for PHP 7.1, this will give me an error. So PHP 3 empty index operator, and I'm having an error saying that empty index operator is not supported for strings. So that's for the third change. Now for the fourth change is the datetime API, which now incorporates microseconds in the constructor. In PHP 7.0, this expression over here, new datetime equals new datetime, this will evaluate to true. Why? Because I'm going to create two datetimes. They will be equals to each other. Why? Because I'm not counting microseconds. Those two datetimes will be probably created in less than 1 second, so they will be having the same value. To illustrate that furthermore, I'm having two variables, now1 and now2, created with new datetime both, and then I'm dumping hours, minutes, seconds, and microseconds of those two times. Let's see what this code will be giving us in PHP 7.0. The equality is giving me true in PHP 7.0, and then the display will be the exact same thing for now1 and now2, meaning that microseconds are not counted when creating the datetime. Now if I execute this same code over here for PHP 7.1, so if I execute PHP 4 datetime microseconds, I'm going to have the equality to false, and then there will be a small difference between now 1 and now 2 in the microseconds value. Notice here that I have a value for microseconds for both now 1 and now 2, and in PHP 7.0 it was 0 for both. So we are actually taking in consideration microseconds, and there is a very small difference between now 1 and now 2, and that explains the bool false over here, which is comparing two date times. The fifth change concerns lexically bound variables. In PHP 7.1, variables bound to a closure via the use construct cannot use the same name as superglobals, this, or any parameter. Here I have the use of use construct, and then I'm using a super global, so this expression over here is not allowed. I'm going to have an error in PHP 7.1, and in the second line I'm using the same parameter as the same name for my variable as a parameter passed to my closure, so this expression over here also is not allowed. And if I name, for example, my function, let's test this code in PHP 7.0, this code will be executing without error. So if I do PHP and then 5, I'm not going to have an error, but in PHP 7.1 this will give me an error. So PHP 5 lexically bound variable, I do have an error saying that cannot use autoglobal as lexical variable in line 5. And if I comment out this line over here, I'm going to have the same problem with PHP with the use of the same name here for both use and parameter. So cannot use lexical variable for param as parameter name in line 6. So this is the fifth change. The sixth change is for encoding and decoding an empty key. Before PHP 7.1, when we are decoding an empty string as key for an array, we will be having this special expression over here, this special value as empty. In PHP 7.1, this have been changed to simply an empty string. So if I dump this in PHP 7.0, I'm going to have this expression, PHP 6. I'm going to have an object because I'm encoding and then decoding an array with an empty string as key. So I'm going to have empty, this empty string over here, designing empty, and the value will be 1. But in PHP 7.1, this has been changed to simply an empty string. So if I execute PHP JSON encoding and decoding, I'm going to have an object with an empty string over here and then int 1. The last change that I'm going to show in this video, and of course there is other changes that you can check out in PHP documentation in the description below. The last change that I'm going to show here, and of course there's other changes that you can check out PHP documentation. I'll be linking this documentation in the description below. The last change is for forbidding return for typed returns. Say that I have a function named sum that will be summing two integers and will be returning an integer as a result. If I execute this code over here, return without a value, I'm going to have an error in PHP 7.1 at compile time. Let's test this out. So in PHP 7.1, if I execute PHP 7 forbid return types, I'm going to have a fatal error. A function with return type must return a value. But if I execute the same code in PHP 7.0, I'm not going to have an error. And this error will be raising even if my code is not reachable, meaning that if I do this, if false, and then return, and this code, I know that this line is never reachable because I'm having false. I'm going to have the same error again. Why? Because this error is checked at compile time and not at execution time. So if I execute again this code in PHP 7.1, I'm going to have the same error, which is a function with return type must return a value. So that's it for the backward and compatible changes. Now let's move on to something more fun, which is the new features that have been added to PHP 7.1. So the first new feature is nullable types. Type declarations for parameters and return values can now be marked as nullable by prefixing the type name with a question mark. Our function over here, test return, is either returning a string or a null value. We are achieving that by generating a random number and testing it against 5. If it is less than 5, we are returning a string, which is elephant. Otherwise, we are returning a null value. So our test return function will be returning either a string or a null value. This is also applicable in arguments for functions. So our test function over here is taking either a string or a null value and then var dumping it. So this expression over here, test elephant, will be possible in PHP 7.1 and displaying elephant for us. This call over here is also possible and it will be displaying null for us, but this call over here is not possible and will be throwing a fatal error for us. Why? Because we are omitting the argument. So we can specify null for the argument, but we cannot omit it, otherwise we are going to be in this case over here, which is the first change that we have introduced in our video. The second change is the introduction of new keyword, which is void. Void basically says that we have no return value, which is applicable in a swap function. For example, this swap function will swap two items provided to it. So void is a good way to say that this swap function does not return a value. Now the third change is symmetric array destruction, which is a fancy word that says we have introduced a shorthand syntax for the list function. Say that we have a data that is containing those two items. The first is an array having 1 and Tom as values. If you want to initialize two variables id1 and name1 with the items with the data of index 0, we can use this expression over here, list id1 name1 equals data of 0. We can also use the shorthand syntax with square brackets, which is equivalent to the list expression, which I find it more convenient and readable. We can also use the same expression in the for each loop. Instead of using list, we can use this expression over here. The fourth change is the introduction of class constant visibility. Before 7.1, we cannot specify the visibility of our consts, and by default they are public. Now we can declare our constants now we can say that our consts are private, protected or public by using those keywords. We can omit the visibility keyword and it will be by default public. The fifth change is for iterable pseudo type. This type will be considered either an array as a primitive type or an instance of transversable. So whenever we find iterable in argument or in return type, we can say that this iterable will be either a primitive type, an array, or an instance of transversable. The interesting thing about this pseudo type is that it can be broadened or narrowed. Let's take this interface as example, which is called example, and we have the implementation of this example interface. We will be implementing the method as well. This method is taking in the mother class example over here an array as argument, and it will be returning an iterable. Now in the implementation, we are changing array by iterable and then changing iterable by array, meaning that we have broadened the parameter, which is iterable over here, and we have narrowed down the return type from iterable to array, and this will be perfectly okay in PHP 7.1. So iterable pseudo type can be narrowed or broadened. PHP 7.1 have also introduced a new function called isIterable to check whether an item is iterable or no. An array, for example, is iterable. An array iterator is an instance of transversable, so it's iterable. A generator is iterable as well. A constant is not iterable and a class is not iterable. Now the sixth change is very useful for people that write the same code to handle multiple exceptions. In PHP 7.0, to handle two exceptions, exception type 1 and exception type 2, with the same code, we have to write the code here and here again. Now in PHP 7.1, we have the catch with multiple exceptions, which is very convenient to not duplicate the code. So we can write this expression over here, we can try our code and then catch either exception type 1 or with the pipe over here, exception type 2, and then we define our exception. And the final seventh new feature is the support for negative string offsets. We can access a string by starting from 0 and then adding up, or in PHP 7.1 we can now access items of string by starting from the end and counting down in a negative index. So AB of 0 will be displaying for us the first item of this string, which is A, and AB of -2 will be displaying for us the second item from the end of this string, which is A again. You can see that also by these two lines. We are defining a string named bar, and the last character of string, which is bar, should be shown for us R. Let's try this code and see what we are going to have. PHP 7, we have A as first display, which is AB of 0, and we have A also for the second display, which is AB of -2. The last character of bar is R. So we are accessing the last item of a string by this negative index array notation. That's it for the new features. Of course, this is not the exhaustive list of all the new features of PHP 7.1. To check that list, you can go to the PHP documentation that I will be linking in the description below. Thank you all for watching. I will be posting some questions. I'm looking forward to your answers to these questions. Thank you. Bye bye.